Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meg Dobbins. I'm an assistant professor at Eastern Michigan. It is my honor and more importantly, my pleasure to moderate our first panel. We have three excellent speakers for you. I will just go ahead and introduce everybody up at the top and then we'll have the papers. Our first speaker will be Vivian Pollak. And she has published 6 books, among them Dickinson, The Anxiety of Gender, The Erotic Whitman, and Our Emily Dickinson's American Women Poets and the Intimacies of Difference. She teaches courses on 19th and 20th century American literature and culture at Washington University in St. Louis, where she is a professor of English and also an affiliate professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies and American culture studies. And I actually had the pleasure of taking some of those classes at WashU when I was a graduate student there. Her most recent publication is an open access bibliography with electronic links called Muriel Rukeyser, The Contemporary Reviews, 1935 to 1980. And she asked me to say that if you Google Rukeyser, The Contemporary Reviews, it comes right up, and to mention that it is being used on 5 continents already. Her current projects include an essay on Walt Whitman and Muriel Rukeyser among the Jews for the Oxford Walt Whitman Handbook. And her paper today is entitled Muriel Rukeyser's Elegies, The Contemporary Reviews, 1950. Okay, and then our second panelist is Meryl Altman. And she is recently retired from DePauw University in Indiana, where she taught classes in women's studies and English. In particular, she included Rukeyser in the course she regularly taught there called 9 Women Poets. Dr. Altman received her PhD from Columbia, where she wrote on modernist American poets, including Pound, H.D., William Carlos Williams, and Marianne Moore. And she has completed several other interdisciplinary projects, including the book her most recent book on Simone de Beauvoir. And her paper today is called Rukeyser's Elegies, Between Rilke and Rich. And our third panelist will be Lukas Moe, who is a graduate alumni fellow in the English department at Yale University. His current project is entitled Archives and Afterlives, U.S. Poetry's Radical Generation, which traces the legacies of poetic modernism in aesthetics and cultural politics from the 1930s through the 1960s. His writing on American poetry can be found in JML, Modern Language Quarterly, and Genre. And his paper today is called The Radical Elegies, Macha, Rosenthal, and Rukeyser's Symbolic Confession. Okay, so I will turn things over to our first speaker, Vivian Pollak.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking Elizabeth for organizing this webinar and by thanking you too, Louise, for your classic book and for the stimulating and informative talk you just gave. I'll begin by telling a story that situates Rukeyser's literary politics in the dangerous terrain of the late 1930s, and that includes Elizabeth Bishop, who also knew a thing or two about the art of losing. On April 6th, 1937, Muriel Rukeyser was living in Hollywood, where she was hobnobbing with the great and the not so great, longing to get back to Spain, living on mail from Spain, working feverishly on US 1, and trying to get her publisher to return her only copy of Spanish Coast, the war novel she was itching to revise. Despite these pressured circumstances, she responded promptly to Rolfe Humphreys, who was co-editing a collection of Loyalist ballads, and Spain Sings, 50 Loyalist ballads adapted by American poets. Dear Rolfe Humphreys, Rukeyser wrote, I shall be very glad to undertake some Civil War translations. My French is all right, my Spanish is not, but in either case, could the originals be sent too? The poems had already been published in French, which is why she mentioned her quasi-proficiency, adding, I've been particularly interested in a poem by Lorca, and in the work of Louis Aragon. If there's any of that material available, I hope you'll send it on with others and soon. Rukeyser specified the poem, Romanza de la Guardia Civil Española, and the journal, the Mexican journal in which it had been published recently. A few days later, Humphreys heard from Rukeyser's Vassar classmate, Elizabeth Bishop, who had been touristing in Spain shortly before the war broke out. Quote, I have just read your announcement in the Times and should like to volunteer my services for the translation of Spanish war poems into English, wrote Bishop. I can read French and also a very little Spanish. I should be very glad to attempt first translations to the best of my ability. She mentions some of the periodicals in which her poems had appeared, including Life and Letters Today, which had sponsored Rukeyser's personally momentous trip to Spain, where she fell in love with an exiled German athlete and convinced herself, despite the horrendous circumstances, that all her erotic troubles had ended. Both Rukeyser and Bishop were disappointed in their assignments, and Bishop changed her mind about participating. Quote, I feel that a simple obituary notice would be more moving, she wrote. Rukeyser persisted, although she protested vehemently against what she called bad poems. Quote, I was sorry that you did not send me any better ones, she wrote. I've seen a great many recently, and all less sentimental, less trite. Will you let it be known that the poems were assigned for translation? Throwing caution to the winds, remember her comment, my French is all right, my Spanish not, she stated, I don't believe the Spanish ballad is either singable or very desirable in English print. When it was published in November 1937, and Spain Sings did not include poems by Lorca or Aragon, but Humphreys did include a general disclaimer in the book, whose other contributors included William Carlos Williams, Catherine Ann Porter, Genevieve Taggart, and Edna St. Vincent Millay. Quote, time, this is Humphreys, time did not permit a careful picking and choosing of material, or the possibility of suiting every assignment to the individual taste, he explained. In a collection of this kind, our poets were pretty much required to take potluck. In the face of this imposition, they have graciously, modestly, and with fine discipline subordinated the personal preference to the common good. Whatever self-consciousness Rukeyser felt about her Spanish disappeared several years later during a long stay in Mexico, where she had an active social life. The parties included at least one Soviet spy, and continued to interest herself in politically urgent translation. Several years later still, her tone was magisterial when she reviewed Humphreys's translation of Lorca's A Poet in New York. In the prestigious Kenyon Review, she praised Humphreys for avoiding, quote, the dangers of literalism and the injection of his own personality. I'll repeat that because I'm going to be picking up on this trope. She praised Humphreys for avoiding the dangers of literalism and the injection of his own personality. Okay, I'm now switching genres. I'm going to wax autobiographical, and I'm going to take the opportunity to say something about reading Elegies in times like these. This fall, I was on an involuntary visit to Rotten Lake. And while reading the first elegy aloud to myself, I felt that Rukeyser had achieved the perfect balance between literalism and the injection of her own personality. Where indeed was Rotten Lake? Was it a specific place she'd visited with an unfaithful lover during the wrecked season, or her bestial, id-ridden self, or some grotesque combination of the two? Thus, Muriel Rukeyser. As I went down to Rotten Lake, I remembered the wrecked season, haunted by plans of salvage, snow, the closed door, footsteps, and resurrections, machinery of sorrow. The snow is a free agent and the only free agent in this incoherent scene, but what does it symbolize? There's also the house whose destruction I weep when I weep you. Did Elizabeth Bishop remember Rukeyser's punctuation many years later when she composed her iconic Villanelle with its unforgettable refrain, "The art of losing isn't hard to master"? Don't say it, Rukeyser writes, with parentheses and an exclamation point. Write it, commands exclamatory, parenthetic Bishop. What is it, though, that Rukeyser doesn't want us or herself to say? Don't say it, she says. And I'm picking up on something that interested Louise this morning. Perhaps the genuine desire is truly untamable. And how is that idea speaking back to the intellectual, emotional, and ethical challenge of poetry, avoiding the dangers of literalism and the excessive injection of personality? When Rolf Humphreys reviewed Elegies, and his was the first review I've located, in The Nation in 1950, he had no intention of taking potluck. Remember, he said poets had to take potluck in his anthology. He had no intention of taking potluck, of suppressing his own personality, or of avoiding the dangers of literalism. He reviewed 4 other books and announced good tidings to begin with, but he ended abruptly with the complaint, quote, "The indefatigable Muriel Rukeyser has appeared lately with 2 volumes, an Orpheus and an Elegies. Of the comparisons she invites with these titles, the less said, the better. Schloss Duino soll lieben," which can be roughly translated as, "I'd rather be reading Rilke." Maliciously, he turned her own words against her, for when she praised his Lorca translation almost a decade earlier, she concluded, "It is in Lorca's poems that his life and death are plain. They speak to us at a voice that reaches with an impact that only 3 men of his time in Europe have had for us: Lorca, Yeats, Rilke." The death of the author, yes, but not the death of the critic, who was out for blood. Humphreys's close personal friend Louise Bogan also raised the Rilke objection. Quote, "We cannot forget that her titles, and even partially her form, approximate those of Rilke's last great work," she wrote. Bogan, who was the New Yorker's poetry editor for 37 years, asserted that Rukeyser had embarked on, quote, "a spiritual journey from chaos toward order and from despair toward joy." But she does this so incoherently, Bogan continues, so superficially and so imitatively that we cannot credit her with much knowledge either of herself or of her world. So this is the more damaging of the 2 reviews, because of Bogan's greater authority as a critic, and also because she's a woman poet. Yeah. Fortunately, Humphreys and Bogan were the outliers, and the other reviews were more positive, to say the least. In the New York Times, Helen Wofford, who was the poet herself, did not hold productivity against Rukeyser, nor did James Caldwell in the Saturday Review, nor did David Daches in the New York Herald Tribune Book Review, nor did M.L. Rosenthal in the New Republic. Wofford stated that, quote, "the theories advanced in the life of poetry may be observed in action in her volume of poetry. She ranges widely in the realms of poetry and all literature." Caldwell exuberantly proclaimed Rukeyser one of the major voices of her generation. Quote, "In a time of shrinking poets and shrinking critics," he wrote, "here, at any rate, is one capable of both poetry and criticism, who expands and embraces." Caldwell was a professor at Berkeley. Calling her a romantic in an age of would-be classicists, Daches praised Rukeyser's rich and mature sensibility. Quote, Here are 2 books of poetry and 1 book of criticism he enthused by one of the most undoctrinaire of contemporary literary minds. Yet Walford, Caldwell, Davies, and Rosenthal all felt that there was something incomplete in Rukeyser's elegiac practice. Rosenthal explaining, the poem sequence with its material from science, the arts, and philosophy has too many facets for adequate examination here. Yet 2 major points come through. First, it is a principled and moving, if sometimes hysterical, effort to grasp the special meaning of our moment in history. That word hysterical, I will be picking up on. It is a principled and moving, according to M.L. Rosenthal, sequence, but it's also sometimes hysterical. It's an effort to grasp the special meaning of our moment in history. That's the first facet he's picking up on. And then he says, second, it's the kind of poetry in which abstract ideas take life from the intimacy of the creators. And he puts the word private, which I appreciate, private associations. We can revise his use of the gender-loaded word hysterical along the following lines. A hysterical Rukeyser is an American woman poet whose willingness to subordinate her story to what she takes to be the common good produces something incomplete. I can just take half a moment to mention that Rilke was not the only influence that these positive reviewers saw. Walford pointed to T.S. Eliot, Caldwell pointed to Whitman, Melville, Piers Plowman, and Shelley, and Rosenthal pointed to D.H. Lawrence. Okay, something incomplete. When she reviewed these selected poems in 1951, Bogan dismissed it by saying, from the beginning of the record, female lyricism has concerned itself with minute particulars, and at best seems less a work of art than a miracle of nature, a flawless distillation, a pure crystallization of thought, circumstance, and emotion. Citing the examples of Christina Rossetti, Emily Dickinson, and Emily Bronte, she observed, Muriel Rukeyser is the one woman poet of her generation to put on Sibyl's robes, prophetic robes, nowadays truly threadbare and unconvincing garments. She also mentioned Elegies and the Rilke connection, but this time with an insulting allusion to gloomy humanitarianism expressed in a deflated Whitmanian language. In extending this talk, I'd like to think further about the fragmented love stories that, in my view, set the Elegies in motion, but love stories in the full context, love of justice, love of peace, love of the world, love of life, as Louise was describing to us, but I'm also interested in the particulars of the fragmented love stories that we get pieces of in Spanish Coast and many other places. Quote, and Louise mentioned this, I prophesied the meeting by the water of these desires, Rukeyser wrote. I prophesied the meeting by the water of these desires, Rukeyser wrote. It's a startling moment and one whose outrageous ambition we're just beginning to understand. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful first paper. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I think it'll be best if we save the questions till till we've heard all 3 papers. So next we will have Meryl Altman. I will turn it over to you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Are the levels right in all of
Yep.
this? Okay, thanks so much for that. Well, I just want to not give my paper, and ask you about yours, but I'll be good and not do that. Uh, um, I really need to thank everybody, and especially Elizabeth, for encouraging me to offer my thoughts, which are really very preliminary and speculative. And I have come more with a set of questions in search of discussion. Um, and I'm especially grateful to the organizers for the prompt to go back and spend some time living closely with this wonderful set of poems, which felt like exactly what was necessary at the moment when the prompt arrived in October. Sam Huber had written in a piece about how the poem that starts, "I lived in the first century of world wars," circulated on Twitter after the election and seemed to kind of come as an answer to something. And I felt very much the same way about all of this. I want to mention too, before I really start, that between that moment of initial contact and rereading and this moment now, my response to Rukeyser's Elegies has shifted a little bit. What I found almost unbearably compelling in the first instance, and I mean compelling in the acts for the frozen sea within sense of compelling, were first Rotten Lake, which I've always loved, and then the other parts that give an account of visceral despair, an account of evil, especially those that speak about the refugees and the children. And about this truly, and that present in an absolutely unsentimental way, the truly irreparable harm that's been done, which resonated, of course, with the harm that's still being done to children and to others who don't belong, quote unquote, within the US as much as elsewhere. But at that point, the more hortatory parts of the poem rang a little hollow, especially the parts about America. Such as the later sections of the Turning Wind one. And when I got to the 10th elegy, the Elegy in Joy, I had a feeling of, well, isn't it pretty to think that now? Of course, all of Rukeyser's work oscillates between the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. And I should explain that if I sometimes find the non-ironic optimistic parts less convincing than the sad parts, that's not because I don't share her politics, it's because I do. And because I sometimes read work in the left tradition in a somewhat elegiac spirit as reflecting a dream or a lost hope of community and solidarity. But I don't feel that way now. And what happened in between was not some hermeneutic working through or scholarly light bulb. What happened was the election. I'll talk about this a bit at the end, but I want to signal two things. First, although this is utterly obvious, when we return to the history of poetry, and especially through the history of poetry about history, what we see and feel will depend on where in time and everything we're standing when we read. But second, before resolution and release can fully come into the poem, it must come into the world, however tentative or temporary that piece might be. Okay, let me explain what I meant by the title of this thing. I've tended to read Rukeyser through the lens of the feminist reawakening in the 1970s, which, as you know, involved a project to recover lost voices, a critical and revisionary attitude toward culture, and especially toward myth, and openness to experience and to sexual honesty. Poetry was important to that at that political moment in a way that poetry in the US rarely is. And Rukeyser is part of that story, not just as a forerunner, but as a contemporary and a participant. Reading from that angle emphasizes the ways in which she was, like Whitman, a poet of the body as well as of the soul, and how that was political. And we've heard beautifully about that already. Today, I'm thinking also about how she was the poet of the soul as well as the body. and how that might also be political. Rukeyser's connection to Rilke, as I wrote in my abstract, was surprising to me to find in a political poet and a feminist. The most charitable thing one can say about Rilke's politics is that he didn't have any. That's the nice way to put it. As William Gass puts it in his reading Rilke, the struggles in the Duino Elegies are quote unquote metaphysical. Escapist is unfair, but that's unfair, but there are things that point in that direction. Also, while Rukeyser never turns away from loss or suffering her own of that or that of others, Rilke seems to actively seek out grief and renunciation as signs of the purity to which a poet should aspire. And his image repertoire deeply identifies this with woman with a capital W, especially beautiful women who die young or who sorrow endlessly for their faithless departed lovers. And this is precisely what Adrienne Rich will turn away from. And not just because it is, as we would now say, appropriation, but because, as she says, women at least should know the difference between love and death. Right? And as for the body, well, for instance, Rilke's third elegy begins, "It is one thing to sing the beloved, another, alas, to him that river god shamefully hid in the blood." Rukeyser, I think, would have said the opposite, that they were the same, that it was dangerous not to acknowledge this, spiritually and even physically dangerous, perhaps. There's a dream of impossible purity, which women incarnate for Rilke, and which women who write their own stories can't really be doing with. But the more I looked, the more specific connections I did find between her poems and his, and especially signaling with the title, when so many of her other poems are elegies in one way or another. The decision to assemble 10 of them and label them in this way is a clear and unusual nod. So what are some of the commonalities? Gass talks about how Rilke's elegies revisit and synthesize the images and the emotional swings of his earlier work. He says the things that were images that were deposited in him like compost. And I think Rukeyser's also consciously do this, summing up and drawing together talismanic images she's used before: the river, the sand pit, the floating man, the real voice, water as both life and death, and especially the child. These are her equivalents of what Yeats called lion and woman and the Lord knows what, as he was trying to move away from them. But neither Rilke nor Rukeyser is trying to move away from them. These are symbols, not allegories. What we need here is not some kind of magic decoder ring. Oh, I know which guy that is. No. And as in the poems, as in Crane's poems, they're symbols rather than images in any imagist or objectivist sense. They pass beyond their immediate context and connect to a system which isn't precisely individual in the sense of private or hermetic, but which forms a characteristic and coherent background. Her word, of course, is system, that can be returned to again and again. There's also the sense of mission, as in Rilke's first elegy, "The springtime needed you, all this was mission." There's a shared language of invocation, the vocative, the imperative, be this. The clearest place, if I have to pick one where Rilke's voice comes through, is the end of the second elegy. "Now be seer, son of sight, hearer of ear, at last." Okay, now Gass says that Rilke was addressing himself, that these are elegies for himself, if for anyone. And so we might see a contrast to Rukeyser if we remember, then I saw what the calling was. At first I thought it was Muriel, but then it was not for me, it was for everyone, right? So that sense of calling. But then again, if Rilke was addressing himself, others seem to have heard him. including Rukeyser, and actually including Rich. She rewrote his Panther poems several times. She's considerably gentler toward him in her poem about Paula Modersohn Becker than Gass is when he discusses that. And in a late essay where she revisits her earliest influences as a poet and talks about what sources she found, she talks about the importance of Rilke's Archaic Torso of Apollo poem. That's the one that ends, "You must change your life." And I should say that when I try to account for why these feminist political poets love Rilke, with whom they don't have much in common, I also need to account for why I do. You know, these things don't always make sense. I think what Rilke stands for in Rukeyser's work, and also more faintly in Rich's, is the question of beauty with a capital B, and the persistence of belief in its sublime and healing power. Now, Keats wasn't quite right about beauty. There are, in fact, other things we need to know. But perhaps truth need not invariably be ugly and bitter. Perhaps our only choices are not, on the one hand, cynicism, and on the other hand, self-deception. But what about those angels? Insofar as my abstract promise to understand what they're doing in Rukeyser's work, I have to say I have failed. And I hope someone else can help me out of this. Angels can be a bit embarrassing. We could contrast Rukeyser's Elegies to H.D.'s Tribute to the Angels, another World War II poem. H.D.'s poem is lovely, but only if you believe in it, which H.D. really did. Does Rukeyser believe her angels and her myths? All of this may connect to the trouble some readers have with the more rhapsodic parts of her work. It connects also to her use of Easter, her use of the term conversion. Does it make sense to invoke the gods when there are no gods, or when our country's gods are not the same as our own gods? And in any case, the angels are not our friends, or not invariably so. We're glad that an angel appeared to Joan of Arc in Rukeyser's early poem, and then also in Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law. But the floating man, for example, is described in a poem, another poem about Barcelona, as the angel waste. All I can say is that sometimes we need angels anyhow, as at the end of her poem for Matheson, where she says, "Angel of suicides, gather him in now. Defend us from doing what he had to do, who threw his life away." Rilke says in the sonnets to Orpheus, "Heil den Geist, der uns verbinden mag, denn wir leben wahrhaft in Figuren. Praised be to God who binds us together. For we really live in symbols, or we live truly in symbols," or, right, just leave it. But that's the question: do we or don't we live in symbols? And if we do, is that a good thing? From Rukeyser's second elegy, the magician has his symbols, brings up his children by them, right? The swastika, the Confederate flag. What ethical role can there be for the wonders of the invisible world when the visible world has been ruined by magical thinking? How can we tell the prophets from the evil magicians when both groups rely on the same set of techniques and strategies? I've been thinking, and I'm not the only one, about why QAnon is so successful, right? And the way that has been successful at tapping into providing a deep sense of belonging, and how this is food for people who've felt hopeless and forgotten, which on some level is everyone. Those were, if you like, imaginative needs, which the left, not to speak of poetry, well, this is contentious, but which is clearly not meeting everyone's needs in that way. But then again, to actually meet those needs might be worse. I don't understand all the allusions in the third elegy. I'm pretty sure Pound was among the magicians. I'm really looking forward to somebody helping me sort out who's on what team there. How badly am I doing for time?
I think you're fine. It's 2:36, so you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Because I want to speak briefly to the question of periodization, whether and in what way the elegies represent a shift, perhaps under the sign of Rilke, from Rukeyser's earlier work. For instance, Ben Hickman speaks of, quote, Rukeyser's move from an aesthetics of witness into a poetics of the visionary, and he sees that as beginning with Ajanta. I have some general thoughts about the usefulness or not of periodizing things, which I will set aside for now. But what I want to say about this particular question is that the different sets of poems are written pretty closely together, or so it looks without, I haven't seen the archive, but you've confirmed that earlier. That being so, might it be better to speak not of a shift over time or a development, but of exploring slightly different genres or modalities to do different things? Still, if the elegies are different in that they are political without being documentary, we could ask why. One thing I could say is that at a certain point, documentary in the photographic sense becomes superfluous because everyone has seen what Virginia Woolf called the photographs of the dead bodies in the ruined houses. The problem isn't ignorance, the problem is numbness. What Beauvoir said about torture during the Algerian War, the worst thing about it is that you get used to it, on s'y habitue. So it's not necessary to point and say, look at what's going on there, right? We know. What's needed is a way to show what we already know in a way that we can't be numb and deaf to, and a new way to use, that's her word, the despair that we all already feel. But I do think it's important that the references in elegies are less local and less specific, which means that it's easier for us to move our own time, our own rotten lakes into them. We don't really know which love affair this was. We don't know where the refugees come from. We don't know which war it is. Which set of mountains is it? In which season did the armies arrive? The speakers aren't sure. Was it in the autumn? Was it in the spring? And there's something being offered there. So the Book of the Dead and In a Different Way, Letter to the Front are in a way tighter and clearer about what they are for and against. But the elegies might have something different to offer by way of openness, being less bound to a particular time of place. This is also true from the point of view of explicit aesthetics. So in the Gauley Bridge section of the Book of the Dead, she asked, what do you want? And the answer was clear. What do you want? A cliff over city? A foreland sloped to sea and overgrown with roses? These people live here. Right, and I've always seen that as a rebuke to, for example, HD, particularly HD, in favor of what as shorthand we might call documentary or committed writing. But now in the third elegy in stanza 5, she asks a similar question, beginning, what do you want? Lincoln blacking his lessons in charcoal on an Indiana shovel, or the dilettante, the impresario's beautiful skull, etc. And it goes on for quite a while. And she doesn't really answer it. Or it might be that she does, and I just don't understand that part yet, which is why I'm here. But I think the move to abstraction is purposeful. You know, when Rilke said, and we all heard, you must change your life, he didn't say how. And it's probably just as well, right? Do we value clarity in poems? It's a 30s question, it's a 40s question, it's a 70s question. The Adrienne Rich of When We Dead Awaken certainly does. Rukeyser's revision of the Orpheus seems to agree, but even those poets who say most clearly we must be clear are not. Williams, Rich, Wordsworth for that matter. Well, no, never mind, forget Wordsworth. Does political elegy need to be clearer and simpler? Does it need to speak to a wider public? Or does it need to be less clear because of the cliches of patriotism, et cetera, that it needs to not resemble? Sebald says in an interview that these things need to be approached obliquely, not ethically, not unethically appropriated, but they still need to be said. Yeah, I'm gonna skip this. So now Lukas Moe, hi, nice to meet you, says, and I really hope he is right. I see Rukeyser's technique of dream singing as a revisionary process, a reflection on the power of poetry to invoke and subvert the genre or fantasy of nation singing. I think Peter Sellers, for one, must have agreed with this because he includes parts of the Elegies and other Rukeyser poems in his libretto for the John Adams opera, Dr. Atomic, which I hope people know. And he includes them there as a counterpoint to the dangerous fantasies of the bomb builders. But to conclude where I began, the nation singing parts were the parts I had the most trouble with in my first reading. And here, periodization really did help me because I was able to recognize that idea of America, idea with a capital A, as the idea of America as material for poetry, as a progressive idea by situating it. The recovery of Concord, et cetera, as a usable past by Van Wyck Brooks, and then by Rukeyser's friend Matheson in American Renaissance, which came out in 1941, as the US was debating whether to enter the war. William Carlos Williams in The American Grain, The Bridge by Hart Crane, Langston Hughes, Let America Be America Again, with its roots in the Popular Front, and so on. And even though Rukeyser's idea of America is a critical idea, like all those other people I just cited, it's critical. A nation of refugees that will not learn its name, the antagonisms that need to unite that we heard about earlier. In spite of that, this felt to me like a distant, or historical, in the restricted sense, image constellation. It's a hard thing to go for any leftist academic anyway, to go back to now. American exceptionalism can't be the solution because it's the problem. Right now, when people, the terrain has shifted to the point that when someone says, this is not who we are, someone else will respond, no, this is who we are, fool. And it's always been who we are, and only the pearl clutchers don't know that, right? So the terrain of this discussion felt like it had shifted. Okay. Space. So it took a long time for the votes to be counted. I was writing in my car And WFIU played Beethoven's Ode to Joy, the international version Leonard Bernstein conducted after the Berlin Wall fell. And I thought, why are they playing this? And then I thought, oh. And then finally I cried a little bit, even though I was driving. And I cranked it up really hard and opened the windows. And later I wrote in my notebook, so maybe it's going to be all right, or less bad, or at least less bad for a little while for some people. And then we had the inauguration, and a young poet stood up and said, change is our birthright. In other words, nourish beginnings. There it arrived, the day when weakness ends. I do not think Rukeyser's poems answers any of its questions. I cannot tell the end. But it does seem interesting to me that where the Americanists took off from the idea of a usable past, Rukeyser in these elegies speaks of the usable present. And maybe her usable present can be part of ours. I'm going to give the last word to Eileen Miles, who was reviewing The Life of Poetry. Quote, "It's great to come to such an American book, a World War II book. The intimacy of understanding firsthand that Franklin Roosevelt fearlessness. We have nothing to fear, but fear itself is pretty good poetry." Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for your paper. And I will turn things over now to Lukas Moe.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to actually share my screen for a bit of this talk, well, for all of it. Unlike Meryl and Vivian, I'm going to give a rather dry paper, but hopefully that will be a compliment than a letdown. Okay. So as we've seen, Rukeyser had many early critics. The most sustained, and I think most interesting of them, may have been a young graduate student living in New York City named Macha Lewis Rosenthal. A prolific writer and a consummate figure on the New York poetry scene, Rosenthal spent most of his career as a professor at NYU and a long stint as poetry editor for The Nation. College students in the 1960s and 70s likely consulted Rosenthal's primers on British and American poets of the 20th century and his critical editions of W.B. Yeats. Today, however, if Rosenthal is remembered, it's not for his account of post-war poetry, where he signally departs from prevailing wisdom, then as now, but rather we remember Rosenthal for coining the term confession poetry in a review of Robert Lowell's 1959 book, Life Studies. Indeed, next to the Beats, the confessionals marked the height of poetry's cultural prestige and notoriety in the post-war United States. What I'll be talking about is how Rosenthal's notion of confession as a poetic mode was not simply a watershed, a moment of eureka when he discovered, when he discerned a new candor of personal and familial detail in Lowell's poems. Confession was also a synthesis of Rosenthal's earlier thinking, one made possible, I suggest, by his interpretation of Rukeyser that began in his doctoral work. A study of Kenneth Fearing, Horace Gregory, and Rukeyser, Rosenthal's 1949 dissertation would go unpublished, reflecting the shift in American literary criticism away from the so-called social poetry of the Depression. Had Rosenthal published his study, perhaps Rukeyser's reception would have been different. Perhaps not, but at the very least, there would have been a strong voice in her corner, and one that importantly understood the language of radicalism. If Rosenthal did not himself feel a, quote, revolutionary conviction, he was familiar with the, quote, world oppressed sensibility of poets on the left. Rukeyser's passionate voice stood out from a regrettable glut of, quote, poems of pathos, as he put it. Writing in 1953, Rosenthal acknowledged Rukeyser's relative youth. She was 39, he 36, as a reason to anticipate the development of her art, as well as why it failed to win, quote, critical attention nowadays. By contrast, Rosenthal's attention to Rukeyser was serious enough to make her early work, in particular 1939's A Turning Wind, a baseline of success and failure from which to depart. His own vision for poetry was decidedly romantic, opting for Yeats instead of Auden as a model for the figures of hero and voyager he saw in the, quote, poetic effort to become whole in Rukeyser. Instead of Marxist dialectics, he detected the, quote, underlying mysticism of a self seeking integration with the cosmos. And in the, quote, struggle of Rukeyser speakers, Rosenthal heard the dissonance between the personal and political. His diagnosis was both clinical and sympathetic. On the one hand, a, quote, young nonconformist personality filled with angry knowledge, whose poems sometimes read like, quote, rhetorical guidelines. On the other, a poet unafraid of testing her assumptions against, quote, observation and self-analysis, expressing complex desire and not simply bending its ideals to her, quote, will. Rukeyser's second elegy, Age of Magicians, is an example of the first variety. The poem imagines a world dominated by masters of technological warfare, which awaits the coming of the prophets, who will vanquish the dark magic with the power of their second sight. Here we might think of Theodor Adorno's account of how Franz Kafka's fiction captured the experience of individuals under the spell of capitalism, making it a superior art to the industrial novel and its supposedly objective representation. For Rukeyser, too, the point was always more to change reality, not simply interpret it. But for Rosenthal, the combat between magicians and prophets went too far beyond a reader's ability to relate. It allegorized the contrast between an experience of alienation, or angry knowledge, as he put it, and the reality of, quote, desire, a dialectic the poet ought to discover through introspection, as, for example, Yeats does in A Dialogue of Self and Soul. That's Rosenthal's example. The effect, in any case, is what Rosenthal called, quote, pragmatic puritanism, a kind of defensive crouch shielded by symbolism that is too eager, even greedy, to be correct. Damning words for a prophet. Like most mid-century critics, Rosenthal was happy to condescend to the woman poet, advising Rukeyser to drop the, quote, business of self-justification and get on with the work of, quote, honest self-clarification. Here it would help to provide some context for Rosenthal's criticism by way of understanding what made Rukeyser's poems succeed, indeed, in ways oddly prescient of the huge commercial success of the confessional poets. 4 years after his dissertation, Rosenthal published an essay in New Directions about Rukeyser's longer poems. It was telling what was culled. No Kenneth Fearing, no Horace Gregory, and scarcely anything about Rukeyser's Depression-era poems, besides the fact of her fieldwork in Spain and the American South. Rosenthal was not the only one writing the 1930s out of existence. Others did so far more actively, and in some cases, vindictively. Indeed, Gregory was among the worst offenders, declaring that, quote, literal politics were no longer a fit subject for poetry. Writing in 1953, the same year Rosenthal published his essay on Rukeyser, Gregory appealed to the anxieties felt by the average American reader during the peak of McCarthyism. Still, it was Rukeyser's poetic career, far more than Gregory's or Fearing's, which survived the 30s. And my sense is that some of the 1930s survived too, in Rosenthal's way of reading Rukeyser. This legacy comes into view in what Rosenthal thought would be the main sources of resistance to Rukeyser's work. First was, quote, the autobiographical confession spilling out over the form. Rosenthal's terms are, of course, hardly detached from his own interest in questions of poetic form on one hand, and confession on the other. Rukeyser was one of those, quote, dissidents of the 30s, according to the title of another essay, whose legacy Rosenthal thought deserved attention in retrospect if it was not a usable past in the present. What distinguished Rukeyser in particular was her engagement with science. There was something to say for her pragmatic approach once it was untethered from mysticism. If a key drive of her elegies is toward the renewal of the self in becoming whole again, this only worked for Rosenthal if Rukeyser first established some personal sympathy with the reader. Otherwise, poems so concerned with life and death were bound to collapse into the ego of a speaker whose act of disclosure, airing of guilt or sin, leads us back to the poet, whose presence is somehow excessive as well as inaccessible, overbearing, yet at the same time distant. A poet, in other words, who couldn't care less about the reader. Seeing this pitfall in Rukeyser's work, Rosenthal turned it to his advantage only a few years later, as I'll show in a moment. He knew that mainstream taste didn't care for the moments of, quote, muddy emotionalism in Rukeyser's work, which for modernist readers especially confirmed its formal incoherence. The longer poems especially, he said, lacked, quote, a proper middle part. So my question is, given the struggle Rosenthal identified in Rukeyser between desire and will, between pragmatism and revolution, what was key about this missing middle part he spoke of? Another way of posing this question, as the rest of my talk suggests, is to ask how and why seemingly formal concerns, the defects or deviations they diagnose in Rukeyser's poetry, come back to the opposition of personal and political. An opposition whose primary fascination in 1950s America was what lay in between, the middle part of conscience and conviction, sincerity and authenticity. This murky area became a staging ground in the Cold War for styles of self-expression that were coerced by the state. One, of course, was confession. When Rosenthal spoke of Rukeyser's tendency to slip into an, quote, old compulsion to explain her motives, he meant to criticize the rhetorical residue of the 30s. Consciously or not, however, he put his finger on the confessional discourse he identified in Robert Lowell, swiftly rising to the status of great American writer at the age of 40. The autobiographical confession that overwhelmed poetic form in Rukeyser became a source of poetic genius in Lowell. Besides the infamous sexism and homophobia of Rukeyser's 1940s reception, much of it laced with anti-radical vitriol, what explains the difference in her use of the personal and Lowell's? Their differences as poets are many and obvious, their politics perhaps more so. Indeed, whereas Rukeyser had only begun to metabolize the radicalism of the 30s in her wartime poetry, not to mention her lectures at the Communist Party sponsored California Labor School, it was easy for Rosenthal to see by 1959 that Lowell's purpose in life studies was, quote, psychological, not political. Despite being rough contemporaries, Lowell's and Rukeyser's paths diverged to such an extent that they seemed to belong to different generations entirely. While I think this is true in hindsight, it confirms the dynastic mode in American poetry studies that proceeds from the age of Pound and Stevens to the age of Auden, through the age of Lowell, and so on. Seeing Rosenthal's role as broker between the pre-war and post-war generations, we can tell a story otherwise occluded by the impulse to discover a break between the early 1940s and late 1950s, a break so fundamental it could only be described as a change in sensibility. This is part of what Lowell does so well. To quote the famous stanza, "These are the tranquilized 50s, and I am 40. Ought I to regret my seed time? I was a fire-breathing Catholic CO and made my manic statement telling off the state and president, and then sat waiting sentence in the bullpen beside a Negro boy with curlicues of marijuana in his hair. Rosenthal knew the instant canonical force of these lines, weighed in the balance of a voice that was brutal and vulnerable, caustic and expansive. Noting also the importance of Lowell's A Mad Negro Soldier Confined at Munich, Rosenthal was wise to the scandalous details here, the carefully drawn caricatures of African-American criminality and mental illness, the casual mention of reefer. This was confession in the new style, a theme unto itself, as the scholar Christopher Grobe has argued, a state of being and doing at once, quote, sacramental, legal, and therapeutic. Or as Rosenthal put it more simply, Lowell waged the constant struggle of the, quote, feeling personality in the face of depressing realizations. At least in life studies, the poet prevailed over the symptom. Instead of this mastery, Rukeyser's confessions were merely an interesting failure. Again, why? The keywords here are personality and generation, which, as the 1950s wore on, increasingly referred to the relationships of self and society, not to the boundary between a sphere of private life and the state. In 1961, Rosenthal could say that Lowell's psychological crisis symbolized the country's, and count on his reader not to take him too much at his word. If he appeared open to the ideals of social democracy from a previous era, as I've been suggesting, he did so tactfully. The premium he placed on the idea of, quote, personal integration reflected the widespread search for humanistic values in the wake of World War II. This emphasis fades after his 1949 dissertation, which praised Rukeyser's, quote, strategic optimism, and took the broadly radical view that modernists such as W.H. Auden, in their obsession with elegy, mistook individual despair for the plight of the masses. This was the logic of the old left, if not the party line. Only a decade later, Rosenthal flipped it inside out, praising Lowell for his, quote, impersonal use of personal elements, which answered the poet's, quote, driving need for liberation, a universal need if there ever was one. Personality had become safely apolitical, and the poet's radical impulses went no farther than the horizon of his generation. So I'll conclude by saying this consensus is beguiled in Rukeyser's Elegies. In these lines from Age of Magicians, we have Lowell's tranquilized 50s, the quiet of the residential streets where nothing ever happens. But the speaker doesn't live there. Unlike Lowell, Rukeyser makes clear that her poem is not a transcript, the voice of a patient discovering and deflecting the causes of insanity in herself. Rather, she's mixing Auden and Brecht. The trope of poetry's survival, from Auden, of course, might offer a figure for the idea of poetic generation. Kenneth Rexroth gave Rukeyser the somewhat dubious title of best poet of her exact generation. And it was Rexroth to whom she sent Dream Singing Elegy in 1944. The poem isn't among the initial group of elegies Rosenthal liked best for how they grappled bitterly with loss. Indeed, Dream Singing Elegy marks defeat by emphatically getting rid of the prophets and magicians in favor of an imagery that remembers Rukeyser's love with the German athlete Otto Bach. Quote, lava beds and, quote, red wounds are harrowingly fresh and defiantly non-masculine. Perhaps Rosenthal didn't like just how personal it was for a poem to refuse the more political function of elegy, which was to analyze and move on. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lucas. I, for one, did not find that dry in any way, shape, or form. Okay, we have plenty of time for Q&A, so I would love to help facilitate discussion. You should be able to simply raise your hand and I can unmute you, or there is also a way to submit, if you want to type a question, you can do that if you just click the Q&A button there, and then I can read your question for you. Okay, I will call on Vivian.
Okay, this is a pretty basic question. We know of Rukeyser's fascination with Houdini. We know she wrote a Houdini script, that she worked on it for a very long time. I think of Houdini as a magician. I've had trouble in reading Age of Magicians consistently sustaining a binary of good guys, bad guys, prophets, magicians. That is, for me, the really scary parts of the poem is when I'm not sure who's who and kind of how I, as a reader, am supposed to respond. So I'd appreciate some, I do mean this, clarification. And I especially like to know, am I wrong to be thinking of Rukeyser's Houdini obsession as suggesting that maybe she's not willing to get rid of the magicians, angels, and so forth?
Can I kick off that one?
Yes, go ahead.
I think that she tended to think of Houdini as a debunker primarily, somebody who knew the tricks and was honest about them. I don't know if anybody remembers a TV magician from, I believe, the 70s and 80s who was known as the Amazing Randy. You remember him? He also shared a lot of the traits of Eric Weiss, who was Harry Houdini. He knew the tricks to a large degree. He was willing to tell people how they were done. The ones that he didn't tell them how they were done, he told them that they were tricks, that they were illusions. They could be explained. There was no such thing as magic. And you have to remember the period in which Houdini was active was also a time when spiritualism was embraced by a lot of people and was a big moneymaker. And part of the version of Houdini that was produced in the early 70s included a major scene of him debunking spiritualism and really wrestling with people who were either promoting it or actually believed in it. So I don't think that there's I don't think there's a conflict between the idea of magicians and her fascination with Harry Houdini.
Okay, would anyone else like to respond? And we do have some folks in the chat have chimed in. So Eric kind of voices a similar idea. Houdini unmasked the magicians. Stefania says there's his role in the congressional hearings against fortune tellers too. Anyone else want to weigh in on the magicians? Yeah, Elizabeth. I think you're muted, Elizabeth. I will unmute you.
Thank you. I was going to chime in on how the prophets differ, because yes, the magicians create illusions for others and bind them with those illusions. It's really a way of controlling a large group, and they at some level seem to believe in their own illusions because they give them pleasure. Whereas the prophet says, being a visionary, he is divided, or Cain, forever shaken by his crime. And this, I think, is a really important reference, that the prophets always, since they see the truth, always feel they're falling short of actually acting on it and getting other people to see it. So the prophets have always a sense of insufficiency and a bad conscience, that they're not doing enough. And they're, of course, not believed. Prophets are not believed. You know, that's sort of the definition of the prophet.
Great. Any further thoughts on the magicians to answer Vivian's question? Or maybe we could also, I was interested in your point, Meryl, about the angels, how angels are sort of embarrassing. So I would love to hear those thoughts as well. Did you have a hand, Meryl?
Well, I don't know that I have much more helpful to say about the angels than I've been able to say. I think I don't understand it. But to the point about the musicians, anyone who can help me with the third stanza of the second elegy, I would very much appreciate that, sort of seconding Vivian's motion. I think Louise really helped me. Thank you with the part with the 1, 2, 3 or 4 after that about, you know, if you never inquired into these meanings, if you had done, you would have been restored. That was another kind of opaque bit for me, in terms of, you know, who's Moses here, right? Or who's being spoken to. But if it's us, then it makes more sense to me, you know, that we're being asked to be prophets and in a way avengers. But the magician has his symbols, brings his children up by them. The children grow in authority and become evil people. But I don't know who those evil people are.
An ecliptic.
Yeah, that too. I made some attempt to see if any of this was tarot, and I hit the wall with that.
Clive Bush has a theory on who they are. So if you read his essay, his chapter in Century's Midnight on Elegies, he offers some thoughts on that.
Is an ecliptic a person who eclipses others and wipes out alternative points of view? I mean, what does that word ecliptic mean? Anyway, you're going to have a hard time persuading me that Houdini's not some kind of magician. I just don't think I can buy that.
Well, I will say that Vivian, the point you started from about it being really hard to find a firm binary, I certainly agree with that. And I think that my question about how do you know the prophets from the magicians is also her question. You know, so if you think about how do you know this is probably a really inappropriate, out of wrong category mistake way of putting it, but how do you know if the person speaking, if it's an angel or the devil or the melange, you know, if you have a vision, how do you know which news source to trust? Right? It says one thing in the forward, it says another thing in the masses. If there was the Times says something else, you know. You know, is that a fiery angel, or, you know, is the house on fire? I think that's part of what's rotten about being in Rotten Lake. I'm sorry, I can't answer this question. Maybe someone else can.
Maybe Rowena has a hand for a while, and she's also written some things in the chat. Rowena, do you want to talk?
Hi. Thank you, everyone, for all of that. Yeah, I was just saying, at the same time, she's deep into working on her Boaz biography by this point, and the dream singing and kind of indigenous legacies on poetics and modernism in that period. And I think that some of those questions are actually part of the allegories and stories she was reading from the Pacific Northwest coast in the period.
And Elizabeth, you have a hand?
Well, it reminds me of the kind of doubleness in Rukeyser that also Catherine Gander talks about. You know, she says there are verifiable facts and there are unverifiable facts, and those unverifiable facts live in myths and dreams and sexuality. And so she always touched on both. I agree, she sets up a very clear binary, and obviously one of the problems is, you know, she is not somebody who thinks there's always a clear binary, you know, we constantly have to choose, but she is quite aware of that. And so for her, just because something is not verifiable as a fact doesn't make it true, doesn't make it not true, sorry.
Any additional questions or comments on that topic? Oh, Trudy's up hand.
I had a different topic, so if somebody wanted to,
Well, I just want to say also on the question of binaries, at least in the later work, I think she has a sense. Well, I'm thinking of the "What do we see? What do we not see?" poem. You know, that there are going to be, which I see as a very clear expression of what we would now call intersectionality, if we understand the true thing about intersectionality, which is that not all the goods, some of the goods are going to be incompatible with each other. So in terms of, yeah, so in terms of binary choices, of course it's not going to be clear. You know, you vote and you hope, but who knows who this guy really is? We'll see.
Dennis, you have a hand. I think you need to, I'll unmute you here.
There's also a question in the quiz Q&A if you want to take that up, Meg.
Oh, is
Go
it
ahead.
me? Yes. This on the binary, and I'm not sure if I really understood this, but in talking about, in Muriel, in one of the interviews I did with her, and her talking about the stroke, she used to talk about, I used to believe in dualism, but since I've had another bout of this disease, which I hate, referring to the stroke, she says, now it feels to me like it's one side of the body carrying the other side back to life. And I can't even complete the thought, but it was sort of a response to this, what she used to say, you know, she used to make fun of this notion of a two-gun society and whatever. Anyway, I'm not sure. I'm going to have to go back and listen to that in the context of this conversation. And I'll be happy to make her words available to you, because she does talk right about this in the context of wrestling with healing from strokes.
Thank you. Okay, so we do have one written comment, which I'll read. This is from, can you guys see that? Can you see the questions, or is that just the panelists? Okay, I will read this out loud. This is from Catherine McLeod, and she asks, this is a question for Vivian. Thank you, and thank you all for your talks. Returning back to your fascinating point that Rukeyser had proposed that she translate Lorca for And Spain Sings, but then was assigned other poems. Do you know if she ever tried to translate his poems later on? She says, I suppose what I'm asking is for you to imagine out loud for us, what if she had been given that assignment that she had requested? Or perhaps too much would have to change in the conditions of that time to make that imaginable.
Oh, what an unbelievably great question. And I'm going to have to leave it to, is it Catherine McLeod? Yes, to Catherine McLeod to speculate about what Rukeyser would have done with a Lorca poem. So far as I know, she never published a Lorca translation, but I do want to follow up on one part of this idea that she's deeply invested in poetry as a kind of internationalist translation project. And we know that she was serious as a student in translating French. But in Elegies, Jan Heller-Levy and Christoph Keller assert that she was proficient in German. And I query that for a couple of reasons. I'm remembering so vividly the communication problems other than body language with Otto Bosch, as we know from Spanish Coast, but I'm also remembering Kate Daniels telling me in no uncertain terms that when Rukeyser left Vassar, she didn't know that she was dropping out forever, but she thought, she was taking a leave of absence. But what Kate said to me is, well, she would have had to have taken, she was flunking German, that she would have had to have studied German and passed the course if she were going to return to Vassar in the fall. And you may remember in Spanish Coast that she says, oh gosh, I wish I had, been more conscientious about learning German. I don't doubt that Jan Heller-Levy and Christoph Keller found some indication that Rukeyser was proficient in German, but I just appreciate somebody else, being able to document that for me.
I'll be happy to jump in. And
Okay.
To paraphrase Bill Clinton, it all depends on what you mean by proficient.
Sorry, I'm unmuted still.
She dabbled in several different languages. I don't personally think she would have identified herself as being proficient in any of them. I think that it was somewhere between struggling and I can get by. The one translation process that I was able to view close up was when she was working on the poetry of Octavio Paz. And I know that her Spanish, she had lived in Mexico for a while. She could get by. I don't think she would have called herself proficient, but she saw her role as turning a translation into poetry. And I know that she worked very closely with Paz, who at that time, this is the late 50s, At that time, he was in India. And so I watched, airmail envelopes going in and out of the apartment constantly. She would run translations by him. He would get back, and his English was quite good. He would get back, no, that's not quite what I meant. I'm not going to give you some lines, but my suggestion is it's somewhere along this direction. She'd turn it around, get it back to him. And of course, back then, the back and forth would take 3 or 4 weeks because of the speed of physical mail. But that was her process in at least that translation project, which was a pretty big translation project.
That's wonderful. It all depends on what you mean by proficient.
Okay, so Lucas and then Dennis has a hand.
Well, I just wanted to interject, I suppose, one thought vaguely on the topic of magic, which, I mentioned Adorno in my talk, and Adorno is writing about astrology in the 40s and 50s, and it's one of his most interesting responses to American culture. And it's as if he's diagnosing something, right, pathological about American culture, which we could bring up to the present in many ways. But then on the other hand, something rather less in the avant-garde vein, something like Waldo Frank and the tradition of secular religiosity in the United States, which was being negotiated in the 40s, when you have people like Waldo Frank who are going to South America and in a kind of emissary role for the United States government in the early stages of what would become the Cold War, right? But the good neighbor policy being a way of spreading the good news of American culture abroad, but sort of figures in that vein of, I guess, secular religiosity, which F.O. Matheson, right, came up briefly before, and the kind of Whitmanian tradition in American culture, which Matheson, of course, is the person who's responsible for cementing that in at least in academic culture, but he's also Rukeyser's defender in this moment. And I just think it's no accident that he lines up with Rukeyser against Philip Roth, Partisan Review, i.e. the kind of Adorno set. And so I wonder if we could think about Rukeyser as on the side of this kind of distinctively American tradition, which is obviously romantic in certain ways, but quite experimental, and it's kind of coalescing in the 40s in particular.
Great, thank you. So Dennis was next, and then we have Vivian.
You're muted.
Dennis, you're muted. I can unmute you.
I got it. So here is her response right before she reads the poem Recovery, about recovering from a stroke. And this is what she says, which I'm not sure I understand, but it might help in terms of binary things. Quote, I'm quoting her now. This is one of the poems, she's referring to recovery. This is one of the poems of recovering from an illness of which I've had another bout recently. And it's an illness that's made by, quote unquote, change of mind, as they say. I used to disbelieve in all forms of binary things, of dualism. I used to make cracks about it and say I'm against dueling. And I hated all that until I had a stroke, when there's no doubt about it. In a stroke, one half of the brain is leading the other half back into life somehow. dragging the other half back. And I hate them, but I do love the work of recovery. So I don't know if that helps,
Thank you.
but it's Muriel.
Great. So we have Vivian and then we have Trudy.
On the F.O. Matheson subject, I got the correspondence, maybe some others have looked at it, between Rukeyser and Matheson around the time of the Partisan Review episode. And I was amazed to see that his letter in defense of hers in Partisan Review is verbatim, paragraph after paragraph, for much of it. I thought it was an astonishing performance, I guess I'd have to say, on his part. She wrote page after page to him. It was a brilliant legal brief explaining what was wrong with what Partisan Review had done to her. And I think he recognized the brilliance of her argument, and he took over a great deal of it word for word.
Great. Trudy, you had a hand.
Yeah, I've loved all of the papers. Like there's so many things that one's thinking of, but I guess I was thinking maybe to go back to a point that Meryl had made about the ways in which the elegies are more abstract and how that makes room for all our own rotten lakes. And I'm sort of just fascinated with that because I was sort of thinking about some ideas of surrealism and as you said, like kind of moving beyond ways in which our imagination's already been captured, you know, and is so pinned down. But the other thing that I think of is like Adrienne Rich with Atlas of the Difficult World, where I feel like that takes Elegy 5, I think, and is like mapping it out. Like, here's what it is. And there's a kind of accountability with the way Rich does it that I'm also fascinated by. I don't have a coherent thought about it, but I'm sort of fascinated by both of them serve these interesting needs. I just wondered what you thought, you know, or anybody thinks about that.
Great. Does anyone want to respond to Trudy? So we are, I should say, 3 minutes past 3:30, but I have nowhere to be until our next thing. So I'm happy to keep chatting here.
We can keep going for a little while, but then we should have a break because then Dennis is going to come up at 4 and we all want to be refreshed when he does.
Yeah, can I just respond
yes,
to
please.
To Trudy quickly, because well, I really want to know what you think about that also, but and tell me if this doesn't seem right to you, but I think what Rich is writing there is not an elegy. I think it's a Jeremiad. And I think that, you know, I've just been trying to kind of catch up with the later Rich that I didn't always follow along with as it came out. And then also the biography. And I think there's more despair there, and less, you know, I don't see the job of me as a critic as telling poets what they should or shouldn't do. But I think that when here's what I think. I think that when she thought she wasn't influenced by Rukeyser, she was. But then when she thought she was less than she thought she was. But that's a whole other paper, and, you know, not necessarily. But I'll just say that Rich's Rukeyser, I guess what I'm trying to say in all of this is that Rich's Rukeyser is only one of the Rukeysers that there are.
Okay, thank you. We do have another typed question. Do we have time for this, Elizabeth, or should we? You're muted, so I can't hear you. I'm going to read it anyway. It's another question to Vivian Pollak from Eulalia. Hopefully I'm saying your name right. To Vivian, do you think that the Book of the Dead, being clearly politically engaged, stands by itself within US 1, or is there any contrast with the rest of the poems? Anybody knows if Muriel Rukeyser ever wanted to publish the Book of the Dead alone? Going further, these dead refer to the Egyptian book, and they seem, and they believed in life after dying and even in the resurrection of flesh. Isn't that already magic and contradictory?
Well, this is a very rich question, and I'd love to have time to reflect on it, but and to come up with a carefully nuanced answer. But I'm not immediately seeing a way to answer this in, say, 30 seconds. So, perhaps.
Maybe we can chat about this and the rest of our questions in the happy hour this evening. Okay, so I will,
Yes.
we can wrap things up. So I just want to do a final virtual round of applause to all of our excellent papers. Thank you so much, and also for this really wonderful Q&A. So Elizabeth, what is our next thing? Do you want to announce where we're?
Yes, so next we are going to, you can just stay here. I mean, you can do whatever you want to, but you will stay in this webinar space, and at 4 o'clock, Dennis Bernstein, whom you have gotten to know, is going to talk about getting to know Muriel during her last years when he was a young man. And it's going to be both anecdotal, wide-ranging, and most likely surprising, and also entertaining. So I hope very much you can join us for that. And then at 5:30, yes, these are long days, we have a happy hour. And my thoughts about that right now are, we will see what happens. I thought it might be nice if we came together and introduced ourselves during the happy hour by talking about what took us to Rukeyser, brought us to her, but we have already, done some of this. So there are lots of questions that we can continue to ask. And I hope that also some of the graduate students and students feel free to ask direct questions of the panelists. And so I hope to see you. Thank you so much for a truly marvelous panel and for the in-depth conversation. Often I miss that when I'm at conferences. Everybody gives the paper and then we sort of go our merry way or not so merry way. So this has been really good. And thank you, Meg, for moderating.